It always begins with a whisper, an old story, told only in fragments, a tale the elders refused to repeat when children leaned too close. You're not supposed to know it. You're not supposed to look into the darkness of certain families. Yet here you are, stumbling into a piece of history buried under churchyards, locked in family journals, and etched into the bones of a rural community that still trembles when the name is spoken aloud. Tonight, I will tell you about the man who ate after death. Hi, everyone. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to hit subscribe and tap the bell icon before this story pulls you in too deep. Our journey begins in the late 1800s, in a weathered farming town tucked deep in the American countryside, a place that never quite escaped the shadow of disease, famine, and superstition. Families worked the land. The fields were lean, and the winters felt endless. In such isolation, the dead were never fully gone. They remained in photographs, in portraits nailed to the wooden walls, in memories carried down by candlelight. But sometimes they lingered, more literally. The story, whispered from one generation to the next, was of a farmer named Elias R. His family had tilled the same soil for decades, their home sagging under the weight of history. Elias was a strict man, bound by routine. Every night, when the sun sank below the trees, he demanded supper with his family. Meat, bread, potatoes, cider. His wife at his side, his children seated neatly, silence broken only by the clinking of spoons. It was not love that held them at the table, but his presence, as rigid and immovable as stone. Then came the sickness. They said Elias took ill in the fall of 1879, coughing blood until his frame grew skeletal. When he died, the family buried him in the cold earth behind the farmhouse, a simple wooden marker pressed into the soil. Life, they thought, would go on, but it didn't. 3 nights after his burial, his wife swore she heard his boots on the porch. She swore she smelled the tobacco smoke curling through the kitchen, and when she walked into the dining room, her heart stopped. For there at the head of the table sat Elias. His skin was gray, his lips blue, but he was eating, slowly, methodically, as if nothing had changed. And the children, they said nothing. They only lowered their heads and continued their meal. The family did not speak of what happened that night. In those years, silence was survival. Yet silence, as it often does, only made the story louder. Neighbors noticed strange things. They said the candles in the windows of the farmhouse burned later than ever before. They said Elias's wife carried food scraps to the back of the house, near the field where he'd been buried. And they noticed the children, once loud and playful, had grown gaunt and pale, their eyes wide with a quiet terror that no one dared name. Some believed it was grief, others thought it was madness. But then came the sightings. A farmhand claimed he saw Elias walking the rows of corn in the early dawn, his figure half shadow, half flesh. A merchant swore that when he passed by the R home, he glimpsed Elias through the kitchen window, seated at the table, chewing slowly, his head tilted unnaturally to one side, as though his neck could no longer support him. And then there was the sound. Neighbors heard it most clearly on still nights, the rhythmic clatter of utensils against a wooden plate, echoing faintly through the walls. It was a sound too ordinary to be frightening, yet far too impossible to be ignored. Folklore gave people explanations when the church could not. Some whispered Elias was a revenant, a corpse returned by hunger. In parts of Eastern Europe, such tales had spread for centuries, of the dead who climbed back to their families not for blood, but for supper, for the rituals of daily life they could not abandon. But here in the American countryside, the idea was alien. And more disturbing still, it was happening not in the imagination of strangers, but in the kitchen of people everyone knew. By the winter of 1880, rumors consumed the village. Children dared each other to pass by the farmhouse after dark. Grown men avoided it entirely. And yet, week after week, Elias's family kept their routine. The table was set, supper was served, and though no one admitted it aloud, a place was always left open at the head of the table. No one wanted to believe it, but everyone knew. Elias had died, and still, Elias ate. The authorities were finally drawn in when whispers grew too loud. In those days, small towns relied on sheriffs and traveling ministers to keep order, both of whom hated the Iran family's reputation spreading like a plague. Officially, Elias was dead and buried. Anything beyond that was heresy, madness, or drunken fantasy. But the evidence mounted in ways that could no longer be ignored. One night, the town minister visited. His diary, still hidden in a local archive, its edges scorched as if someone once tried to destroy it, records the visit in haunting detail. He described walking into the farmhouse kitchen, the smell of boiled potatoes heavy in the air, and finding the family seated stiffly at the table. Every face turned pale as the minister entered, but none dared move. He wrote that the food on their plates remained untouched, all except one place. The chair at the head of the table, though seemingly empty, had scraps missing, utensils disturbed, as though someone unseen had already begun the meal. The minister demanded answers, but none came. The wife, trembling, claimed her husband's spirit refused to leave. She said Elias insisted on eating with them, and if they refused, strange punishments followed. Doors slamming in the night, livestock sickening without cause, children waking with bruises they could not explain. She begged the minister not to speak of it, for fear of what Elias might do if shamed. The sheriff, hearing of this account, threatened to dig up Elias's grave. But when a group of men finally did, they found something worse than rot. Elias's coffin was empty. Only claw marks, gouged into the wooden interior, remained. The earth above his burial was undisturbed, which meant only one thing. Elias had not stayed buried. The discovery fueled hysteria. Some insisted the family themselves had conspired, feeding the illusion for attention or protection. Others whispered Elias was no man, but something else entirely. And yet, the most unsettling detail remained. Every night, without fail, the sound of utensils still echoed from that farmhouse. Dinner continued, with or without guests. The town kept its distance, but the story spread, bleeding into neighboring villages, passed down as a cautionary tale, one no one dared to repeat near the farmhouse itself. Time did not quiet the story. Instead, it grew heavier, like a sickness that clung to the soil itself. By the mid-1880s, the farmhouse stood apart from the rest of the village, not by distance but by dread. Families built new fences, paths rerouted, and mothers warned children never to glance at its windows after sundown. Yet the family within could not escape. They lived as prisoners of their own table. Visitors who braved entry spoke of the atmosphere, the way the house itself seemed to listen. They said the air was always colder inside, even in summer. Plates were chipped, but polished spotless, as though the ritual of dinner had become sacred. One child, grown and speaking decades later, admitted that no one dared serve themselves until the head chair moved first. Elias's place, though his body was never seen again in full form, always came alive before the rest. The family changed in ways people noticed. Their eyes hollowed, their movements slowed, their laughter disappeared entirely. Some believed Elias was not just eating food, but feeding on their vitality, binding them to him with each meal. The more they dined, the more they seemed like shadows of themselves, pale echoes of the children and mother they had once been. Folklore wove its way deeper into the tale. Old European settlers compared Elias to tales of the Nachtzehrer, a corpse that devoured itself and then its kin. Others thought of revenants, spirits tethered by unfinished rituals, refusing release until every last tradition had been honored. Supper for Elias was not just a habit. It was a binding, a contract that death itself could not sever. And yet, perhaps the darkest whispers came from the family's descendants themselves. In hushed words, decades later, some claimed the Ai lineage still carried Elias's shadow. Generations spoke of eerie dining rituals, of photographs where one extra figure always appeared, blurred but seated at the table. These were dismissed as tricks of light or feverish invention, but the unease lingered. The farmhouse was eventually abandoned. Its windows shattered, its roof sagged, and yet those who dared enter swore that in the silence of the dining room, if you listened long enough, you could still hear it, the faint scrape of a fork against wood. Dinner never ended. By the turn of the century, the R farmhouse had become a place of pilgrimage for the curious and the cursed. Travelers whispered about it in taverns, and thrill-seekers from neighboring towns dared each other to approach. What they found was not a ruin, but something worse, a home preserved unnaturally, as though time itself refused to move on inside those walls. The plates remained stacked neatly, the chairs positioned in their old arrangement. The dust disturbed only around the table. Some claimed the family was long gone by then, either dead or vanished without a trace. Yet locals swore they had seen movement through the curtains. Not shadows, but figures. A woman bent in half, as if carrying unbearable weight. Children sitting rigid, eyes forward. And at the head of the table, always the same shape, gaunt, rigid, jaw slightly unhinged, as if locked mid-chew, a doctor from Philadelphia once investigated, hoping to debunk the tale. His letters, discovered years later in an estate sale, tell of an overnight stay inside the farmhouse. He described the sound first, that same scrape of cutlery, then the stench, faint but undeniable, like soil freshly disturbed. But the most chilling detail he left behind was his sketch. In shaky charcoal lines, he drew the table, the chairs, and in the head seat, a half-visible man with hollow sockets for eyes, staring directly at him. The doctor left before sunrise, and never spoke of the case again. Folklore soon branded Elias not as a man, but as a ritual, a cautionary spirit. He was the hunger that never ceased, the echo of every family secret carried too long. For some, his story became a metaphor for grief that consumed generations. For others, it was proof that the dead could cling, not out of love, but out of need. And still the question lingered. Why food? Why the dinner table? Perhaps Elias had starved in life. Perhaps he had sworn some unholy pact. Or perhaps it was simpler, darker still. He could not let go of the ritual that defined his humanity, even after humanity itself had abandoned him. What terrified people most was not that Elias existed. It was the thought that he might not be unique, that in other villages, on other forgotten farms, families sat quietly, night after night, serving meals to those who should no longer eat. As the decades wore on, Elias's tale slipped into something darker than folklore. It became a stain on the town's identity. The farmhouse eventually collapsed under storms and neglect, but locals whispered that its foundation remained cursed. No crops grew where its stones once lay, and those who built nearby claimed to hear the faintest noises at dusk, dishes clattering, chairs dragging, voices mumbling in prayer before supper. It was as if the ritual had survived the wood, brick, and blood of the R family. Records from the county courthouse show a peculiar pattern. Families who moved into the area often reported strange disturbances, not the grand, cinematic kind, but subtle, insidious ones. Food rotting faster than it should. Chairs shifted slightly from where they had been left. Children refusing to sit at the head of the table, sometimes breaking into tears if forced. These families rarely stayed longer than a year. When asked why, most replied with the same phrase: "We weren't welcome at our own dinner table." Perhaps the most unsettling account came in the 1930s, when a journalist from New York investigated after hearing rumors. He published only one article in a fringe occult magazine before abandoning the subject. In it, he described interviewing a woman who claimed to be the last surviving grandchild of Elias R. She lived alone, far from the old homestead, but admitted she still felt her grandfather's presence. She spoke in a hushed, cracked voice. "He eats with me. Even now, I lay the plate. I hear the scrape. I can't stop." The journalist dismissed it as madness, but ended his article with an eerie confession. The night after speaking with her, he awoke to find his dining room disturbed. His table had been reset, knives and forks laid out in perfect order, a single chair pulled back. If Elias was merely a ghost, perhaps he would have faded. If he was only a story, perhaps it would have died with his bloodline. But Elias had become something else entirely, a ritual bound not to one family, but to anyone who dared remember. And that is the true horror of his legacy. You don't need to live in that farmhouse to invite him in. You only need to tell his story aloud. What remains of Elias R's story today is not carved in stone or recorded in history books. It lives instead in whispers, in the cracks between truth and fear. Town records omit his family entirely after a certain year, as though they were erased. No graves, no wills, no proof of where they went. Some insist the county deliberately buried the truth to protect its reputation, while others claim the family never left at all, that they simply dissolved into shadows, one supper at a time. The legend persists because it is not easily dismissed. You can laugh at ghost stories, mock superstitions, or point to rational explanations. But what of the homes across the countryside, where families quietly cover mirrors at night? What of the towns where chairs are never left at the head of the table, always pushed firmly in? These little customs, unspoken, unrecorded, may be all that's left of the curse, carried unknowingly across generations. Some folklorists believe Elias represents something deeper than one man's haunting. To them, he is a symbol of the dark things families bury, secrets too twisted to acknowledge, yet too powerful to ever fade. The dining table, a place of union and tradition, becomes a prison, binding generations in silence. Each scrape of a fork is a reminder that the past is never truly dead. It eats with us. It shapes us. And maybe that is why the story still has power, because when you hear it, you cannot help but imagine your own table, your own family. You can't help but wonder who might sit with you, unseen, the next time the plates are laid out. So ask yourself, was Elias just a tale to frighten children? Or was he the first glimpse of something we were never meant to understand? A hunger that follows bloodlines, feeding on silence, secrecy, and ritual. The farmhouse is gone. The family is gone. Yet the scrape of cutlery echoes still in me, Emery, in fear, and perhaps in your own dining room tonight. Dinner never truly ends. Every story leaves a scar. Drop yours in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Something is always listening.